So, it's Christmas Eve, and so in light of that, I just wanted to talk about a little bit of kind of where Christmas comes from, more or less. That uh, Christians historically have celebrated since about the 4th, 5th century something known as the Christmas calendar, the Christian calendar, the doctrinal calendar, the liturgical calendar. It has multiple names depending on kind of which kind of orthodoxy you kind of find yourself in bed with. But uh, it actually, the reason that we celebrate Christ's birth in the end of the year rather than at the what would have most likely been his actual birth date, somewhere between like June and August, um, depending on kind of how the calendar works itself out. But the reason that we do that is that Christians historically, the most important date in their lives was the resurrection of Christ, which we know without a shadow of a doubt would have been during the Jewish Passover, which is in the spring. Jews dictating their calendar on the basis of the lunar cycle, so we know exactly when it happened. Now, so we then celebrate every single significant moment in Christ's life, measuring all the way back through spring into the winter, through into kind of the early fall, where you have Advent, which is started by the Annunciation, which would have been when Mary receives the message from the angel Gabriel, through the wise men visiting, and the which is Epiphany in the first weekish of January, and then you have just all these things that go through of his baptism, which is typically either the last week of January or the first week of February, which is technically the end of Christmas tide, and so that's when historically that's when you would begin to take down your Christmas decorations or whatever, and then it would go through the beginnings of his life. They'd celebrate the Ash Wednesday and all those things, and so that his entire life during what is like the coldest part of the year, the times when people are most gathered together, they're focusing on the life term, the life and ministry of everything that Christ did. The wedding at Cana, and the feeding of the 5,000, and the upper room, and all those things are intentionally highlighted by this liturgical or doctrinal calendar. And so they go through all the way back to fall. And so that rest of about almost 4 to 6 months, referred to as ordinary time, and that is basically, you continue to live as Christ did, hopefully, serving your community, serving each other, your family, and everything. But it's not like, it's that now the intentional is that it's called ordinary because now you've been ordained, because the last thing that happens is Pentecost after the 50 days. And so we highlight those as that now that you as a Christian, you've been sent out, and it's your job now through the rest of that ordinary time to minister as Christ did in his life. So we would spend 6 months focused on what Christ did, and then 4 to 6 months on what we are now called to obey into. You have the example, and then you have the practice. Example and practice, so that the entire year becomes a cyclical wheel that we follow through. of the example and the practice, example, practice, so that every time it would begin to become ordinary, or it would begin to become like mundane, you would then begin that Christmas or that Advent-tide season again, and that would remind you of why we do what we do. Why do we serve our community? Why do we give of our monetary and our physical resources? Why do we do these things? Because Christ. Because He is God with us, because He came. And then He not only came to us as an infant, but He fulfilled all of the rites according to Moses' law. If you look in the early chapters of Luke and Acts, you hear a lot of according to the law of Moses. He was baptized and dedicated to the Lord according to the law of Moses. He was baptized by John the Baptist according to the law of Moses. He was all this. He was circumcised on the 8th day according to every single one of those things, because His duty was to fulfill the law that we could not fulfill, because He was perfect in a way that we are not perfect, because His nature was flawless in a way that we are not flawless. So that's what Christmas is. Now, you might hear a lot of protestations from secularists or pagans or whatever it is on the internet, or honestly stupid Christians and the red Starbucks cups controversies and various things like that. But very simply, we celebrate Christmas as Christians now because of Christ. However, the world does not celebrate Christmas because of Christ, because it is their nature as a fallen being, baptized in sin, immersed in sin, for them to resist and rebel against God. So, you should not, as a Christian, expect people in our country to celebrate Christmas with Christ at the center. You shouldn't expect that. I don't know why you would, quite frankly, just because it's traditional or whatever. But simple fact is, you as a Christian need to set the example in the same way that we follow Christ and His example. You need to set an example of what it means to celebrate Christ in Christmas healthfully, and obeying His teachings, but also following His example in His behavior. Remember how that Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount of that the Pharisees sat in Moses' seat, so you should do whatever they tell you. However, do not do what they do. The same thing needs to apply to our approach to the highly commercialized kind of Christmas season of that. I mean, it's expected that you're going to get gifts for your children, but you don't need to indulge the myths and lies of Santa Claus. It's expected that you should give, and it should be out of an overflow of your heart that you would give to your children, I think. However, I mean, the point is, I guess, this is what I'm kind of getting. I'm meddling a little too much. This is the point. I would recommend highly that every Christian out there study the history of Christmas and the history of Advent. You will reap abundant benefits as far as your faith, especially if you go through like Reformed catechisms and their history with it, because I think it'll be very useful. But I think it would also be very helpful for all of you out there to also begin to study just the life of Christ. That not just reading the Advent stuff or the Advent calendar stuff that we all are so used to during the season, going through maybe even getting a full-length Christmas or Christian calendar, guided Christian calendar guidebook, something that will take you through the life of Christ from now all the way to Passover and eventually Pentecost, so that you can actually see what that looks like. Because it'll change your Christian life. And I think it'll recenter a lot of what you do in the coming months, and through, if you make a resolution or not or whatever, it'll change a lot of and recenter and refocus a lot of it back onto what the point of our life is supposed to be anyways, and that is Christ. So with that, Merry Christmas, and I hope that you have a joy-filled Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and the remaining days of this year, and that all goes well with you, even if life is challenging for you. All right? Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year.